JBS presents the Hampton Synagogue's Author Discussion Series with Rabbi Avraham Bronstein.
My name is Glenn Dorskin. Welcome to the Hampton Synagogue. The Hampton Synagogue Author Discussion Series, now in its 27th year, is a cultural highlight of our summer season, both for members of our congregation and our many visitors from across the Hamptons. I am proud to serve as series chair, and it is my great pleasure to share our past season with you, our global congregation, in celebration of Jewish books.
I've done many events. I've actually never opened the book. And I carry the book every time, so thank you. And it's a heavy book. Okay, so this is from the prologue, the very beginning. And it's entitled One Hogan Place, which we will talk about. I never look back. In a career unlike any others in the annals of American law, he prosecuted every order of crime and every species of criminal, bribe takers and bribe givers, serial killers and drug dealers, mobbed up families and mobbed up industries, molesters and rapists, stalkers and terrorists, gun runners and gamblers, prostitutes and vigilantes, loan sharks and digital pirates, bookmakers and boiler room operators, arms dealers and insider traders. He had seen the good go bad. Crooked politicians, crooked cops, crooked bakers, crooked truckers, crooked union bosses, crooked bankers, crooked accountants, crooked ambassadors, crooked priests, crooked rabbis, crooked doctors, crooked coroners, crooked engineers, crooked PTA officers, crooked CIA agents, crooked philanthropists, crooked turnpike authority executives, crooked traders, crooked defense attorneys, crooked prosecutors, crooked judges, and crooked inspectors of everything made in New York City, from its steaks to its skyscrapers to the cement of Yankee Stadium. There were crimes of passion too, but few by comparison. The urge always seemed to start and to end with money. Money was the oxygen. Stop the flow, he would say, and you'll stop the crime. Now, after 35 years as the District Attorney of New York County, Robert Morris Morgenthau, at 90 years old, was leaving the job. A quartet of reporters flanked the DA, one on either side, two across the long table. The last of the farewell press conferences had come weeks earlier. Now, as he spoke, photographers ducked in and out, edging across the half-packed boxes that formed the islands in the cavernous room to record the final hours. It was nearly 8 o'clock on a cold Friday evening, New Year's Eve, in the last year of the first decade of the new century, and the district attorney, called the boss by 3 generations of prosecutors, was holding court one last time. That's from the prologue. And it goes on from there, but it begins on his last night.
His last night. So the book is really a monumental undertaking, if you think about it. I'm sure you've thought about it. What made you want to take it on? What interested you in this particular family?
It's a great place to start. Thanks. So, as you said in your great introduction, I actually was known as a Russia guy. I had spent 10 years on and off in Moscow, and we may, when we get to Q&A, want to talk about what's going on over there now. Mm-hmm. I was a Moscow correspondent for Time magazine, and then for the New York Times magazine, I went back several times. I still go back to Russia. The first 2 books were really about Russia, and as I moved into biography and then more closely looking at and reporting on New York politics, I was obviously fascinated by the then mayor, Mike Bloomberg. Thought about doing a biography of him. Turns out that Mayor Mike, as he's known affectionately, had, of course, a fantastic career on Wall Street. But when you go back to his childhood, and certainly to his parents and his grandparents, as some of you may know, he's a very nice Jewish boy from outside Boston. It's not that thrilling a story, although people have done great books on Bloomberg. So I was looking around, and a friend of mine actually had gone back to work, and he had gone to work for the DA's office. I knew the name Morgenthau from the Secretary of the Treasury, from the New Deal in the Roosevelt years. Mm-hmm. I had no idea that Robert Morris Morgenthau was still the DA of New York City, New York County. People say Manhattan, but he really was the DA of New York County. And so I went to go see him. Mm-hmm. And very long story short, I had an hour interview, 45 minutes with him. He was 89 years old at the time, and he was in his 9th term. He was going to run, and by all accounts, he was going to run again for his 10th term. And he had a good slogan, 90 and 09. And I had no idea that he was going to soon retire. That's his last night, a year before he had announced his retirement. And the interview was more of a vetting. And I was not vetting him, he was vetting me. Mm-hmm. And it was a very unsubtle reverse interrogation. I was asking questions, but I realized by the kind of questions I was asking him, he was sizing me up. And in that very first afternoon, we talked about all sorts of things. We talked about the Bernie Goetz case. We talked about the Central Park jogger case. He voluntarily told me about his daughter. He had 7 children, one of whom, a daughter who was born severely mentally disabled. And he told me right away that she had never recognized him, and that he went upstate. She's was in a facility. She's since passed away. Upstate, and he went to go see her. He was extremely open, in other words. And I had told him that I had read the diary. It's not really the diary, those of you who speak German. It was a Lebensgeschichte of his great-grandfather, Lazarus Morgenthau, the patriarch who comes to America first. And I think that not only caught his attention, that caught his curiosity, and then things went from there.
Was that reading of the diaries, that was part of the research that went into this book and that interview, or that was a totally separate kind of thing? At that time,
it's a great question. Yeah, at that time, I was only going to, I was thinking about doing a profile for the New York Times Magazine, the Sunday magazine. And he wasn't really interested in another profile. This is a man who had been profiled hundreds of times, if not thousands of times, over a 50-year career in New York City. The most legendary, the most famous, whatever your politics, prosecutor in American history, nationally. I mean, wherever I've spoken, people know the name Morgenthau for the DA, and not just fans of Law and Order, which I have to confess I've never watched, and he had never watched it either, the TV show.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so I'm pretty thorough, hence,
right.
well, not just the length, but over a decade devoted to this book. I had read everything I possibly could about him. And I was a writer-in-residence at the New York Public Library at the main branch. And there in the Dorot Jewish division, they have one of the few bound copies of Lazarus Morgenthau's Lebensgeschichte, written in 1842 at the ripe old age of 27. So it's a life history of a very young man, written on the verge of marriage.
So it's interesting because the project started really with Robert, right? You know, generation number 4, but really most of the book is about generations 1 through 3, as it turned out. Like, at a certain point, you must have been aware that the focus was kind of shifting way back into the past.
Yes. When I had great fortune when I was doing the research and I put together a proposal, and it was a long proposal, it was probably 60 pages. My agent takes it out to different publishers. I was very blessed. They all wanted the book. And I got to interview them. And each of them said, we don't want a book just on the DA. We love the idea of what I call the long arm of history, that it's 4 generations, that it's an epic that tells the story of one family, but it's really the history of America. It's not just the history of New York City. Some people say it's the history of America. It's actually the history of one family at very high levels of public office across 150 years, including the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, World War II, the New Deal, the birth of Israel. It's really world history. Much of that history, though, to your point, I had no idea when I first met the DA.
So that was going to be my next question, which was, when you first thought about taking this project on, did you have some sense of who the Morgenthaus were as a family or as a history? And did that impression, if you had one, did it change over the course of writing the book?
Yeah, I had, I would say, a pretty good notion, somewhere between vague and pretty good, about the Secretary of Treasury, Henry Morgenthau Jr., who to this day is one of the longest, and not the longest serving cabinet members in U.S. history. He never graduated college. In fact, he flunked out of Cornell twice. It was one of the touchy moments I had with the DA when I got his transcript, his father's transcript. He also never graduated prep school. So we have a cabinet member who had never graduated high school. And the reason for that was he was undiagnosed with dyslexia. So I had a vague notion, obviously, of his role in the New Deal, but nothing, although he's in hundreds of books on the Roosevelt years, and on the War Refugee Board, and on the Holocaust. Nothing could prepare me for the archival work where you, whether it's at the Library of Congress or up in Hyde Park at the Roosevelt Library, where you go through the Morgenthau diary, again, another diary that's not a diary. It's the in and out box that crossed everything across his desk.
Every bit of correspondence.
It is 890 something volumes up in Hyde Park, upstate. Much of it, if not all of it, is now actually digitized. It's online. And it's an extraordinary, probably the biggest collection of public papers at that high level that we have in the history of American, the executive branch and the Treasury. So I hadn't gone into that granular level. I certainly had an idea of the role he played with the New Deal. And that's really, your point is, that's the fulcrum of the book. Henry Morgenthau's moral awakening, when he learns about the Holocaust, what he calls the horrors in Europe, it lasts 18 months after the Wannsee Conference in January 1942 up until January of 1944, when he finally gets the okay, the blessing, from the man whom he adored, FDR. It wasn't just his best friend of decades.
Also his patron.
FDR was the sun god. He blocked out everything else. His patron, his second father. He was older, but not that much older. FDR, when he was stricken with polio, let Henry carry him. They had an incredible, intimate relationship. Very little of it was known. Very little. So it didn't set out to be revisionist, but I think, and I've been pleased by the response, that Henry Morgenthau has always been a caricature in American history. The Morgenthau Plan is what he's unfortunately probably best known for. And so I was able to address and redress those major points in history.
So that's you going back through the archives and looking through all the papers and going to the original sites and the presidential libraries, etc. Besides Robert himself, who was 89, 90 years old when you first interviewed him and had the idea for a profile, which became the book, who else in the family did you speak to over the course of writing, and how supportive were they?
It's a good question. So when I met with him, we had a series of interviews. And 89, anyone who's ever met Robert Morgenthau knows that at 99, he was sharper than I am right now. I have a difficult time, as you can hear, speaking of him in the past tense, because his mind was so agile and so alive, and his memory was exacting and precise. Middle initials, middle names, street names. He lived, as I write in the prologue, in at least 3 different time zones. Time zones being not geographic, but in chronology. He would talk about the L. He would talk about horse carts. He knew and had met every president of the United States since Calvin Coolidge. We would pass, and we would be driving, and we would pass, Bruckner Boulevard, places and bridges that are named after people long dead. That we can't pronounce, let alone remember. Louis Lefkowitz, again and again and again. It became a running joke. And occasionally I would say, Mr. Morgenthau, who was this, expressway named after? He said, damned if I know. Sorry, we're in the sanctuary. He had a very salty tongue. He was a sailor. So he lived across many different planes, and even into his late 90s, his mind was extraordinary, and his health, he was blessed with very, very good health. There would not have been any book without his blessing, but it was not authorized. He never asked to read a word. He never put any barriers in my way. But I learned, to your question, the very first time I went to an interview, I learned about what they call the closed circle, by which all information goes back to Robert Morgenthau. All information in New York City and perhaps beyond.
Do you think that there's a particular resonance for the story of the Morgenthaus today in 2023? You started writing the book, 10 years ago, but now that the book is out now and things are happening in the world now, is there a particular lesson that this family, these personalities, their stories have for us in our current moment?
Yeah, it's again, these are all, your 3 questions are part of one question, and you're making me think, so thank you. How is it a German Jewish American story? How has the family changed generation by generation? And what is the resonance for Americans today? It's doing well to do good across generations at a time when very, very few people are thinking that way. We can talk about it more in questions and answers. One of their geniuses, one of the things I saw in letters and diaries, and then with the DA for more than a decade up close, I was privy to it. How can a man go after Roy Cohn and be friends with Donald Trump? How can a man be very, very close to Cardinal O'Connor and also with Ariel Sharon? Not exactly opposites, but that was a fact. Very different. That was a fact. It's something that Lazarus Morgan, the patriarch, begins doing. He grew up in a strictly Orthodox family, very poor, everyone, all their professions were tied to the faith. He leaves all that behind. He essentially crosses every border possible, whether it's in his religion or in his nationality. He's a free spirit. He actually becomes a member of the Mannheim Freethinkers. And gives a portal to the Catholic Church and a bell to the Protestant Church. It's bridge building. Not always for mercenary reasons, but sometimes for mercenary reasons. Henry Jr. was not a New Deal economist. He obviously oversaw the budgets. It drove him almost crazy, literally. He was not a free spending. So the boogeyman of the far right, Henry Morgenthau, the Morgenthau Plan, it drove him crazy, the deficit spending. He oversaw the fastest rise in spending in U.S. history. He was a fiscal conservative. He was not an ideologue. He was much closer to the Republicans on finance and many other issues than he was to FDR. My point is that this notion, which we hear so much about, the inability to reach across the aisle, they were in each generation essential bridge builders. And that is, it's something that Robert Morgenthau, as the DA, he didn't see it. It was literally in his DNA. He didn't see it as a political strategy or as a tactic. And when I came to see it as one of the main through lines in the book, He kind of shrugged his shoulders and says, well, so if you see it that way. It didn't occur to him to do anything else. But there are extraordinary moments, as reviewers and readers have said. How can the ambassador, who's the finance chairman for Woodrow Wilson, make common cause with a man named Charles Crane, who's one of the most infamous anti-Semites in American history, who also helped fund Wilson's campaign, and later went and saw Hitler in Berlin, sympathetically walked away with it. So there are many, many cases of this willingness, and more than a willingness, there's even an affinity to listen to the other side and to make common cause.
Wow.
Yeah, that I think is resonant for today.
We've been talking about the family kind of refracted through the life stories of four great men. We've been talking about them. So you have to say something about the Morgenthau women.
Exactly. Thank you. And I do in the book. It's one of the from day one. I thought and wrestled with how am I going to tell the women's stories? How am I going to bring the women to life when so much of it, there are millions, we didn't talk too much about it, millions and millions of pages of documents, and very, very few written and about the women. Mm-hmm. The women, the paper trail was deliberately erased often or never created. In the archives, first of all, I could find the letters. Many members of the family gave me letters. Every generation has a strong, very intelligent, very forthright woman, not behind often, and not just at the side, but in front of their husband. And I am pleased that so many people are responding to those women. It's not just the men's story. History knows the Morgenthau's, the men, but that's why I felt obliged to go as far as I could. Morgenthau, Eleanor Morgenthau, FDR called them the two Eleanors. Her best friend was the more famous Eleanor, inarguably the most famous American woman of the 20th century, perhaps in the world in the 20th century, was her closest friend. The Morgenthaus were very unusual and unique in that way, that both members of each couple, they had a quadrilinear relationship, and there are several chapters that trace that evolution, not just from when FDR was stricken with polio, but even before, as early as 1912, maybe even earlier. And Eleanor, without getting too deep into it, but Eleanor Fatman, as she was known by her maiden name, had gone to Vassar. She was born very wealthy. She was a Lehman. She had gone to Vassar. Eleanor Morgenthau, as you all know, did not go to college. She had, I think, 3, if not 4 children by the time Ellie even graduated Vassar. So this was something, she didn't envy it. She might have envied it a little bit. She really admired her. Eleanor Morgenthau was, if her husband was known as Henry the Morgue by FDR because he was always glowering, he was literally wringing his hands, he had terrible migraines, he was horrible in speaking in public, he couldn't even stick to a script. His wife was a brilliant speech maker. She had been the head of the Drama Society at Vassar. She actually taught at the Henry Street Settlement drama. She was a natural in public. She had a terrific political savvy and acumen. And I was able in the archives to recognize her handwriting. And I found, which is reproduced here, I described the scene. In the 1920s, she went upstate. This is just one example, very quickly. She's giving speeches with Eleanor Roosevelt. And I found an early draft, and I thought that was her husband at first. It didn't sound like his vocabulary, it didn't sound like it was eloquent and it was strong. It sounded more like Hillary Clinton in the late 21st century, in the early 21st century, than her husband. And it was, in fact, Eleanor Morgenthau. I could tell by her handwriting. She edited most of his speeches, if she didn't write them. She was a terrific political strategist, and but for her, he never would have had the success he had.
So what you're saying basically is that the TV show should really be about the women, and that would make it more interesting.
I hope that they're interesting in the book too. Yeah. It's a little bit different on the Rothschild women. They weren't antagonistic. They weren't. Again, it wasn't about. It wasn't for me. It was about how to make this particular man, even Babette, the aforementioned long-suffering Babette,
the matriarch,
which actually may be the most melodramatic saga in the story, the matriarch and what happened to her with Lazarus. It's, as I said, rags to riches to rags. She really is probably the greatest martyr in the book. She also showed, although there's very little trace of her in history, she also shows her strength and her stamina and her endurance and her love. This is a family with a lot, as I said, a lot of difficulties, but a lot of love. And to generalize, it's unfair. Each generation, the women really were not out of obligation, but out of a familial sense of moving the whole family forward to do good. It sounds corny, but to do good, they're out front to help their husbands. The last story, 2 sentences, Martha Morgenthau, the DA's first wife, who was not Jewish, goes upstate. He's running for governor. He ran for governor twice. He failed miserably. He liked to forget the second campaign. He was up against Nelson Rockefeller, probably the greatest Republican politician in New York State history. And Martha Morgenthau, who had never given a political speech, as far as I was able to tell, flies up in a blizzard to Buffalo, gives a speech because her husband couldn't come. He was waiting for the president, JFK, in Manhattan. She's 8.5 months pregnant. And she won over a ballroom of over 2,000 Republicans, and it was a largely Republican audience. And all the reports, and I was able to interview people who were there, she absolutely stunned them. And when I found that out, the first thing I did was I told the family, her children, do you realize your mom did this? Including the woman who, the now woman, who was embryonic at the time. Yes, exactly. It's an incredible story, and it's not only is it a forgotten story, it was not a known story. And the reason why, you may wonder, JFK was holding things up in Manhattan because it was the Cuban Missile Crisis at the exact same time. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.